Come gather round, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone.
Hello, I'm Jeannie Gable. Welcome to my home. My husband and I moved to a vibrant senior community near La Jolla, California in 2018. From our 18th floor balcony, we enjoyed dramatic sunsets. Most of all, we enjoyed visits from our children and grandchildren. Jeffrey's kids, all on the East Coast, Peter, Amanda, Huxley, JT, and Sam, visit us when they can get to California. My family lives closer, Northern California and Southern California, and this is largely their story. By 2018, they had dwindled to a smaller cast of characters. In the top row, my firstborn granddaughter, Lauren. Her dad, Joe Amandoli. Her mother, Gable Girl Sean. And Lauren's husband, Louis Harris. In the middle, Gable Girl Holly. Jeffrey, me, and granddaughter Ginger Port. Along the bottom row, grandson Brody Port, Bobby Lee, the husband of my only niece, Heather, and my nephew, Brian Bodenheimer. In 2015, my younger sister, Cheryl, died. She was just 71. Cheryl was my only remaining sibling, the last blood relative in my generation. I began to think about my mortality. All I had regarding our past was a box of mostly undated photos. There was no one else to ask about the family history. If I didn't tackle this daunting task, the stories would be lost forever. I thought about my two daughters, Holly and Sean, and wanted to leave them more. It wasn't just for the two girls, it was also for their children, grandchildren, and generations to come. I wanted to give them a gift that no one else could give, a gift that money could not buy. That is when I began documenting my family history. I started in 2015 when my husband, Jeffrey, and I were living in Santa Monica. By cutting back on my interior design practice, I made time available. The first step was to divide that box of photos into two parts. The first part became a 12-volume, 100-year history of my broader family that I called Decades. My grandparents were born in Lebanon and Syria. As you may know, there is frustratingly little historical information now available from that part of the world, not even through Ancestry.com. I'm still working on this project. My mother and father were first-generation Americans. Many colorful stories of my ancestors are detailed in the Decades books. My father, shown here on the left, was one of 4 brothers who enjoyed hunting with friends. Hunting was more than a sport. It provided essential food in the height of the 1930s Depression. The second project, an 8-volume, 50-year coming-of-age saga of over 700 pages, it chronicles my 2 daughters' lives. I named it Giving Thanks because many of the stories centered around the Thanksgiving holidays. That project is complete. This photo of my daughters was taken in 1976. 40 years later, in 2015, I began writing their stories. Thanksgiving was just around the corner, a good time to tell the family I had started these projects. I showed them preliminary pages of the books, but there were so many gaps to be filled in, I needed help. How could I convince these 2 full-time school teachers and full-time moms to give up a few precious Saturday mornings, drive to Santa Monica, and help Mommy Dearest with her invasive retelling of their lives? I decided to offer them a little bribe. They loved the lunches and the triple berry cake at Sweet Lady Jane, their favorite Santa Monica neighborhood cafe. Over the next 2 years, we worked together, mostly by emails, regarding who, what, when, where, and how. Piece by piece, 50 years of the Gable Girls' history began to take shape. Tired of photo sleuthing, I began drafting the stories for each of the photo pages. Just when I thought my work was perfect, I would hand it over to my husband and editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Moore. When editor Jeffrey could be persuaded to take time away from his 24/7 work week, he would mark up my copy mercilessly, especially the punctuation, and hand it back to me. What I've shown you at this point took place in 2015 in Santa Monica. Since you might be confused by my appearance in some old photos that I'm going to show you, I first have a confession to make. I'm not legally blonde. Following are 12 images, same gal, different hair. Age 4, natural hair. Grade school hair. Engaged at 19 hair. Gloria Steinem look hair. Mexico, upside down hair. Dyed black curly hair. Glamour hair. Tinfoil for blonde hair. Jeffrey's favorite hair. Rain-soaked hair. Mix A plus B for lockdown hair, then smear goop on hair. 1960, Santa Monica, California. I was 20 years old. Barry Gable was 28. We motored off on our honeymoon with a hope and a prayer that we would live happily ever after. 4 years later, our first child, Sean, was born in Orange County. Her favorite place has always been Disneyland. Soon we moved to North Hollywood. We bought a house on a street with mature magnolia trees and the iconic white picket fence. Sean's dad was a bank manager. His office was only a 10-minute commute to nearby Hollywood. Curiously, he often didn't return home until after midnight. It seemed as if bank loans were negotiated at the top of a tall building at Hollywood and Vine. These were the days of Mad Men and martinis and, well, you know, Barry's failings were booze and women. 2 years later, on Christmas night, after our coffee and pie, Sean's beloved grandparents gathered her up so her mom and dad could drive through the streets of the San Fernando Valley to the hospital and bring home a baby sister or brother. Holly Lynn Gable, as a true Valley girl, held out until after midnight to be born on December 26th, the best shopping day of the year. If prompted, Holly can still mimic Valley Girl talk. When baby Holly was only 6 weeks old, we moved to Thousand Oaks, 30 miles away from the Hollywood lifestyle. It was a breath of fresh air that became our Shangri-La and the happiest time of the marriage. But 2 years later, Barry accepted a job back in the San Fernando Valley. Studio City was no Shangri-La, but the house we bought in the Long Ridge Estates did have mature magnolia trees and a white picket fence, and the girls had their own swimming pool. When the Gable Girls were born and nurtured, social changes of the 1960s and 1970s were having a profound impact on families everywhere. We listened to the words of Bob Dylan and the music of the Beatles. We read The Joy of Sex. These were the days of self-indulgence and narcissistic behavior. Our society seemed to be falling apart. So was the Gable Girls' intact family. Our marriage looked like a storybook fantasy, but there was no fairy tale ending. Barry and I had owned 3 houses, but hadn't lived in any of them long enough to build substantial equity. My share of the divorce proceeds was modest. My priorities: 1. Keep the girls in the same school district. 2. Budget 12 sessions with a psychologist. 3. Enroll in Merritt College of Court Reporting. 4. Hire a live-in housekeeper for, would you believe it, $35 a week. 5. Find a second job. Each night after dinner and a bedtime story, I tucked the girls in. Then I worked banquets as a cocktail waitress at the upscale Sportsman's Lodge. Fortunately, I never needed much sleep. The Gable Girls and I moved a mile away. I rented a small house where my parents visited often. To paraphrase the words of my Lebanese countryman, Khalil Gibran, there was both joy and sorrow in that little house. The next slide I'm about to show you is deeply personal and difficult for me to share. My parents were first-generation Americans, kind, warm, generous, and loving, with strong work ethics, but their hearts were heavy. The young man on the right was their only son, my brother. He was 10 years younger than I and had recently been discharged from the U.S. Army following a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. His smile in this photo is deceptive. He was a troubled soul. He is no longer living. During this period, I sheltered Sean and Holly as much as possible. I didn't want them to hear the talk about my brother's downward spiral into insanity. The sad times really make you cherish the good times. And there were good times. They included slumber parties, trips to Disneyland, building a snowman with Mom, clowning for their grandparents in Santa Monica, and best of all, hamsters. Then politics intruded. Proposition 13 was great for homeowners, not so much for renters. Our little rental house went up for sale. Thanks to the offers of down payment money from 2 guys I knew, I could have bought the place. But I had just graduated from court reporting college, needed to work full-time, and be a full-time parent. I didn't need those complicated offers. Because the answer to both guys was no, we moved again to a nice apartment in the same school district, and the girls could have pool parties again. However, before long, 2 additional political issues made it clear this wasn't a long-term solution. First was busing. Busing was a well-intended national movement that began as a voluntary experiment, but it was about to become mandatory. I was a full-time working mom and concerned about my daughters spending hours each day on a school bus. The second issue was the condo conversion trend. It was just a matter of time before our boutique apartment building was converted to condos. About a year after our divorce, Barry Gable met and married daytime soap opera star Valerie Sterrett. They lived in Valerie's Long Ridge area house and later bought a beach house in Malibu for weekends. The young Gable Girls even had a cameo on General Hospital. When they visited their dad, the Gable Girls enjoyed the Malibu lifestyle, including the Malibu Riding and Tennis Club, where they played tennis. However, as you can see from Sean's body language, she was less than thrilled by becoming a stepsister. I began to look at alternative cities. Santa Barbara was too far from my Los Angeles income base, but the family-friendly city of Ventura, just 50 miles northwest of the San Fernando Valley, had good quality schools that were already integrated, no busing needed. Plus, the living costs were much lower. The Gable Girls were able to call the Ventura Keys their home for 7 years. As compensation for moving away from their Valley school friends, the girls found a Doberman puppy under their Christmas tree. I named him Zeus. Growing up at the beaches, Santa Monica, Malibu, and now Ventura, Sean and Holly were becoming true California girls.
I wish they all could be California. I wish they all could be California. I wish they all could be California.
Along with their protective puppy, Zeus. About this time, I was becoming concerned about my daughter's desire for things that weren't in my budget. They often wanted to hang out with her friends at the mall and buy stuff. One November day, I told them we're taking a road trip. We put our packed lunches into my VW Squareback, and we headed 185 miles south to Tijuana, Mexico. I wanted my daughters to see that many people in this world do not enjoy the privileges that they and their friends had. We drove through the slums where they saw children in tatters playing in the dirt. Nothing much had to be said on the drive home, but from that Thanksgiving forward, Sean and Holly always wrote a thankful list. Not long after that Tijuana trip, the Gable Girls became involved in various types of volunteering, with no prodding from me. If you took high school Latin, you might be able to translate this. Always sisters, forever friends. Sean and Holly had each other's backs. They still do. Today, Sean lives in Northern California, and Holly lives in Southern California. They text each other every morning. By this time, I had used my deposition reporting experience to establish a successful business, combining court reporting, deposition reporting, and attorney services. I leased office space near the courthouse and outfitted 2 ocean view conference rooms. This became a neutral site for attorneys from 4 counties to hold depositions. As a busy mom and business owner, sometimes I needed extra help, especially if there were multiple depositions to be expedited. That's when I called on the Gable Girls to pitch in by copying and binding the deposition pages. Of course, they were thrilled to help. Right. With the success of my business, I was able to buy Sean a car for her 16th birthday. At the time, I didn't realize that Fiat stood for Fix It Again, Tony. In order to give my teenage daughters a secure place where they could hang out after school, I purchased a family membership at the Pierpont Racquet Club. Although I didn't spend much time there, it wasn't only for the girls. One day, I was soaking a torn-up knee from a ski accident, and I met a guy in the jacuzzi. How very California. We met again on the tennis court. Kent Atwater was a former semi-pro football player, originally from Florida. He loved everything to do with water, boating, diving, swimming, and especially surfing. The following December, we were married on a boat, the Monte Carlo. We cruised the harbor while a jazz trio entertained 90 guests. Although Kent's kids were older and on their own, we now had a blended family. Following the nautical wedding, Kent and I left on a ski trip, and later the Tahitian Islands. When we returned, we moved temporarily to a large house in the Ventura Keys. Sean and Holly had the 2 upstairs bedrooms. Are you wondering about the red arrow? It's pointing to Holly's bedroom window. Curiously, the screen to that window was sometimes found on the roof below. You see, she didn't like my strict school night curfew, so she found a way around it. After we went to bed, Holly quietly got dressed. Then, wearing gloves to protect her hands, she slid down the roof, onto the fence, and jumped to the ground. From there, she took off with her friends. Meanwhile, Sean and her boyfriend enjoyed Kent's regulation-size pool table. Every year after I took them to Tijuana, the Gable Girls wrote their grateful lists, a tradition that lasted for decades. Just to illustrate their teenage thinking, Sean wrote, "Kent, glad to have a man around the house. New sister and brother. Same old mother, same old sister." And Holly wrote, "My phone bill is almost paid off. Kent's goofy golfing pants. That I'm taller than Jeannie." The girls adored their easygoing stepdad, Kent. He once had to retrieve them in the middle of the night from the scene of an accident in a friend's father's car. Fortunately, they weren't hurt. They had sneaked out, figuring they'd tiptoe back in around 2 a.m. The policeman called to the scene was not nearly as intimidating as the thought of facing their stern and now wide-awake mom. I'm just grateful they made it through those teenage years unscathed. Soon we moved to a larger, on-the-water Keys house. Kent and I were boaters. We owned both a sail and a powerboat. This was our 41-foot sailboat. The two of us would often go to the Channel Islands for the weekend. The girls preferred to stay on land. As we left the dock, Sean and Holly waved and said, "Have a great time." Then these fun-loving teens raced to the phone to tell their friends, "Hey, the party's at our house tonight. Pass it on." This photo grouping shows Sean's high school years. In the top row is Sean in her Fiat. Years later, she told me that as many as 8 kids piled into that small convertible. And to the left of that photo, you can see Sean in a phone booth. You remember phone booths, where she was often found calling the Fiat mechanic. We laugh about those times, but it wasn't all foolishness. Sean spent summers volunteering as a YMCA counselor. After 2 semesters at Ventura College, Sean went off to college in San Diego. Here's our party girl a year later. Sean wrote to me that she had met a guy who looked like Tom Cruise, had a great voice, and owned a motorcycle. Yikes. And she wanted to bring him to Thanksgiving dinner just 2 weeks away. Our family Thanksgiving that year was at Lake Arrowhead. Sean and Joe announced they were engaged.
In Napoli, where love is king, when boy meets girl, here's what they say. When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, that's
And most of all, this party's for us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
when the world seems to shine.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See
See
you at the
ya.
wedding.
Bye.
can't prepare for all the things that change your life. They come suddenly and unannounced. Just 4 days before Kent left for the Florida reunion, I had completed the sale of my corporation to a national company, and Holly, having recently graduated from UCLA, had moved the last of her stuff out, leaving us with an empty nest. And I had begun a major remodel of our house. This standard scale of life's stresses was created in the 1960s. A psychologist said I was off the charts. My personal stresses at the time were nearly devastating, and they happened all at once. I had been named administrator of Kent's complex and illiquid estate that contained 7 properties, most over-leveraged, leaving different percentages to various beneficiaries. Sean and Holly were wonderfully comforting and helpful, alternating weekends to spend time with me. Kent's family, his daughter and son, and their spouses were also generous and kind. I confided to my daughters that when I looked in the mirror, there was no one there. Thanksgiving dinner that year, 1990, was hosted in Laguna Beach by my sister Cheryl and her husband Denny Ekstrom. Sean said a prayer before dinner, and Holly raised a glass to Kent. May he be surfing the big waves in the sky. After the holidays, I did something crazy stupid. I tried to escape the herd by moving to Paris, alone and not speaking French. Such a romantic city is not the place for a grieving widow. Still, being away on my own strengthened me. In Paris, I started to move beyond sorrow and rediscover some of the joys in life. I was determined not to be anybody's object of pity. As always, the sad times make you appreciate the good times, and I'm very grateful that over my 85 years, I've enjoyed many good time adventures, including paragliding in Mexico, encountering a cobra in the Thailand jungle. You could see the sweat on my face. Diving the Molokini crater in Maui, riding a camel through the surreal landscape of the fairy chimneys in the Cappadocia region of Turkey, and exciting experiences in Africa, India, the North Pole, Italy, Australia, Japan, Europe, the Middle East, and much more. But the best place I visited wasn't distant or exotic. It was this little house next to a fire station, the house where I was born in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. The current owner, a Mrs. Weatherly, shown on the right, graciously welcomed me back when I visited after more than half a century. She explained that the 4-room brick schoolhouse across the street had been torn down to make room for a new police station. This is a class picture in front of that old school. We were a tough ragtag group. I'm the kid in the front row, second from the right, with the clenched fists, permed hair, and high-top white shoes. Then I visited the second house where I lived. During my 6 years there, I was a cheerleader. Friends and neighbors were always dropping in, including high school student and future football Hall of Famer Joe Namath, who loved my mother's cooking. Beaver Falls is a small town of about 8,000 people north of Pittsburgh. It was once a thriving community where the largest employer was U.S. Steel. But with the closure of many American steel mills, Beaver Falls today is a shadow of its former self. The happiest part of all my travels has always been coming home to the Gable Girls. When I returned from my stay in Paris, I sold the waterfront house in the Keys and bought a 2-bedroom fixer-upper in the Santa Barbara Riviera. That is when I got hooked on the creativity of the remodeling process and enrolled in UCLA's 3-year graduate program on interior and environmental design. When I graduated in 1997, Sean and Holly were there in the UCLA Sculpture Garden with me. Now back to 1993. Sean had given birth to my first grandchild, Lauren Amandoli, just in time to meet Anne, her great-grandmother. When baby Lauren was only 1 week old, we drove in the pouring rain on the freeways to a hospital in Laguna, where my mother was able to hold her great-grandchild close to her heart. Mother died a week later. When Holly took that 4-generation photo, she was on her way to a film and photography career. As a high school student, Holly was active in tennis and track. She graduated at 16 and then spent a school year with a host family in Japan as an AFS exchange student. After returning from Japan, she entered UCLA as a Japanese major. During her junior year abroad, she once again studied in Japan, with side trips throughout Asia. After graduation from UCLA, Holly worked in the film industry, where she met Joe McGraw, a producer. They exchanged vows on Sugarloaf Mountain in Rio.
Tall and tan and young and lovely, the girl from Ipanema goes walking, and when she passes, each one she passes goes, ah.
At the next year's Thanksgiving dinner, Sean and Joe Amandoli and baby Lauren, along with Holly and her UCLA friends, filled the house with laughter. It was a fun Thanksgiving, except for one thing. Producer Joe McGraw, who was negative. Later I confided to Holly that I'd rather have a double root canal than spend another Thanksgiving with this unpleasant guy. "Don't worry, Mom," she replied. "You won't have to." A year later, Holly met Kelly Port, a Hollywood visual effects expert who has since been nominated for 2 Academy Awards. After dancing late into the evening, the newlyweds left for a honeymoon in Italy. 1997 was also remembered as the Little Red Riding Hood Thanksgiving at my Santa Barbara house. Following dinner and the reading of the thankful lists, I surprised my granddaughter, 4-year-old Lauren, with tickets to her first live play, Little Red. As Lauren and I headed out to Mid-State Street, Sean and Holly, along with husbands, also headed out, but for Lower State Street and some pub crawling. As the new millennium began, the Gable Girls were happily married and raising their young families. Holly and Kelly took their family on several fun trips to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, to visit Kelly's relatives, while Sean and Joe enjoyed spending time with Joe's family in the Pacific Northwest. I was still living in Santa Barbara, working as an interior designer and writing a book about finding the elusive 5-star guy. In the 10 years since Kent's boat accident, I had dated many great guys. Call them 4-star guys. But 1 star was always missing. And then I met a very, very special guy, my 5-star guy. Although we lived in separate cities, we soon became serious. By that November, Jeff wanted to get to know the Gable Girls, so he invited the family to his Santa Monica townhouse for a traditional Thanksgiving dinner. Driving from different cities, the girls were curious and a bit uncertain about what this Thanksgiving Day would bring. After an impressive dinner, Jeffrey set up a tripod to take the first of what became annual Thanksgiving photos. The baby is Holly and Kelly's first child, Ginger Port. 6 months later, Jeffrey and I planned a small, private wedding. But our friends and family wanted a celebration, so they hosted a pre-wedding party at the Hope Ranch home of a best friend in Santa Barbara. Well, Jeffrey and I don't always agree. 3 weeks later, overlooking Big Sur, we said, "I do." I sold my Santa Barbara house and moved temporarily to Jeff's Santa Monica condo. He said that as a writer he could live anywhere, and he promised that we would soon buy a home in Santa Barbara. In the meantime, I continued to work as an interior designer. That gave me time to enjoy some fun in the city, such as this autumn afternoon with Holly and Ginger in the pumpkin patch. Pumpkin patch? On Wilshire Boulevard? Yeah, sure. I have to admit it, we are 3 generations of Beverly Hills shoppers. We bought a 1-bedroom house on a 2-acre lot with extraordinary views. Unfortunately, you couldn't see much of the ocean from inside the house. It was poorly sited. Along with our architect, we decided to tear it down. But first we hosted Thanksgiving dinner there, in the empty house. Our tradition was to take a classic lineup photo, then make silly faces for the camera. This was the site of one of our most fun Thanksgivings, the empty house party. A caterer brought in a table, folding chairs, and paper plates, as well as the turkey dinner. Lauren and Ginger couldn't believe it when I handed them boxes of crayons and invited them to draw pictures on the walls. Their artwork lasted until the house was disassembled, and everything salvageable was donated to Habitat for Humanity. I was driving to Santa Barbara once a week to work with an architect in drawing up plans for a new house. This is a computer-generated rendering, which became this reality 2 years later. By this time, 2006, Ginger had been joined by a brother, Brody Port. Brody is now a music major at UC Berkeley. He also completed a semester studying in Japan. Ginger has graduated from Bard College, is working in the film industry, and has traveled extensively. Thanksgiving that year was hosted by Joe, Lauren, and Sean, plus Sean's beloved dog, Keiko. They welcomed us to their new Ventura home in the wooded subdivision of Weston Village. There was plenty of clowning around outside, with good food and music inside. The Gable Girls' father was often part of our Thanksgiving celebration. Once again, you can't prepare for all the things that change your life. They come suddenly and unannounced. In November 2008, a wildfire ripped through the hills of Montecito and the Santa Barbara Riviera. Hundreds of houses were destroyed, including most of our neighborhood. This is all that was left of our next-door neighbor's house. That car was inside their garage. Our house remained, but we lost 2 acres of mature trees and vegetation. Most of our neighbors lost their houses. Fortunately, we were all safe. We evacuated in time. 2 weeks later, Holly and Kelly wanted to host Thanksgiving. On the drive south from Santa Barbara, Jeffrey and I picked up Barry Gable at his long-term care facility. Sean drove with Joe and Lauren to her sister's house. The zany Holly and Kelly loved mugging for the camera. We set up the tripod to take the annual lineup photo. The Gable Girls' dad, Barry, was in all the other photos that day, but Jeffrey explained that this particular photo had been taken every year with the same people lined up in the same positions. Jeff thought Barry would understand why he was asked to sit out this one photo. The next day, Barry called Holly to say his feelings were hurt. An avalanche of emails followed. After 2 years, Jeffrey and I resumed hosting. Although our neighborhood remained mostly empty, our bronze sculpture survived the fire, and the vegetation came back. But the city of Santa Barbara was slow to issue rebuilding permits for our neighborhood. Still, our home was welcoming. Thanksgiving dinners weren't all turkey and fixins. What everyone really looked forward to was the annual turkey quiz. Jeffrey gave everyone a chance to display their knowledge of Thanksgiving trivia. Here's one of his questions. Ginger knew the answer, and the answer is 86 pounds. The next year, Lauren, a college girl now, had moved to Northern California and wasn't in our annual photo, although her mom held up a placard to include her. This was a year of changes. Sean and Joe, affected by the recession, moved temporarily to her dad's lakeside condo. Holly and Kelly's marriage was impacted by his extensive work travel, and they decided to go separate ways. Tired of living in a burned-out neighborhood, Jeffrey and I sold our dream home and moved back to Santa Monica. Our philosophy? If the plan doesn't work, change the plan, but don't lose sight of your goal. Sean and Joe's goals, their priorities, family, food, and fun. Kelly and Holly continued to follow their passions, even if living in different parts of the world. Jeffrey was still traveling on business for Mike Milken and the Milken Institute, and finding satisfaction in his work. I wanted a big project. So we bought a condo in Santa Monica, in a building that needed major renovations. I even took on the unwanted project of seismic retrofitting. That led to my being elected president of the Homeowners Association and far more extensive improvements. It looks a lot better, right? Well, as you know, no good deed goes unpunished. Some owners criticized me for gentrifying the neighborhood. Although I missed Santa Barbara, it was a blessing to live closer to Ginger and Brody. I was also closer to my Laguna Beach family, nephew Brian on the right, my niece Heather, and her husband Bobby Lee. In 2014, the Gable Girls mourned the loss of their father. As Bob Dylan famously put it, the times they are a-changin'. One advantage of living in Santa Monica again was joining the Jonathan Club, where we continued to host Thanksgiving dinners at both the Jonathan Beach Club and the Jonathan Town Club. Sometimes we even danced on the club's roof. But Sean and Joe wanted to move to Northern California to be closer to Lauren and to Joe's side of the family. Lauren has since earned her MRS degree and has made me a great grandmother. Holly could now take another 4-generation photo. For the first time in the 34 years that they were married, Joe was able to have Thanksgiving dinner with his side of the family. Sean wrote, "Yes, Mom, that's a real bearskin rug in Joe's brother's weekend cabin." In 2017, Jeffrey and I decided we wanted more time to write and to travel. That began our search for a place to retire. We sold the Santa Monica condo and moved to our new home, the V Retirement Community near La Jolla in San Diego. Now that I'm in my golden years with time to reflect, I recognize how very grateful I am. That concludes my stories of one family's changing times. In future decades, stories of Thanksgiving will be told by the Gable Girls, Sean and Holly. Thank you.
Come gather round, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, or the times they are a-changin'.